All right, I see it's starting to level off, so I think we'll get started. So again, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Anita Nickerson. I'm the Executive Director of Fairvote Canada. Fairvote Canada, for anybody who is new, is a nonpartisan, nonprofit citizens campaign for proportional representation. And we have indeed been around now for 20 years since we incorporated as a nonprofit. And just to state the obvious, it's not the kind of cause where you want to be celebrating 20 years. I'd prefer to be celebrating we got proportional representation 20 years ago. However, a lot of work and lessons and learning and building this movement has happened in the last 20 years. So we have a lot to be proud of, and hopefully we will not be having a 40th year anniversary. So today we have 4 special guests joining us. So we have Andrew Coyne, Elizabeth May, Judy Rebick, and Hugh Segal, all of whom have been around since the beginning or very close to the beginning of Fairvote Canada. So before we get started tonight, I wanted to give a land acknowledgement. So I am in Kitchener, Ontario, and I'm going to read my land acknowledgement because I'm no good at remembering it off the top of my head. So Kitchener is situated on land that is the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. We recognize and deeply appreciate, and I really do, their historic connection to this place. We recognize the contributions of Indigenous peoples all across Canada, the contributions they've made to our community, and we reaffirm our collective commitment to make truth and reconciliation a reality, especially in light of the rather horrific events this week. So for those of you joining us, the format tonight is each guest is going to talk for about 7 to 10 minutes. I'll introduce them one at a time. And then we will have the last half as a question and answer. And I'm going to use the questions that were sent in to me by supporters ahead of time this time, just because it's easier than trying to navigate through a question and answer box. But I would very much encourage you to say hello in the chat, to say where you're from, to chat with other people who are watching this webinar. And Michelle is here from Fairvote Canada to answer any questions and help with any tech issues. Okay, so we'll get started with Andrew Coyne. And I'm going to read Andrew's short version of his biography. So Andrew Coyne is a columnist with the Globe and Mail, a member of the At Issue panel on CBC's The National, former national editor of Maclean's, former columnist with the National Post. As Canada's best known proportional representation advocate in the mainstream media, Andrew has written countless articles on the absurdities of first past the post elections and the need for proportional representation. And I can tell you how much we enjoy and look forward to those articles, and we share them. And it's a refreshing voice in our mainstream media. So I'm going to turn it over now to Andrew.
Well, thank you very much. And sorry if I cut things a little close just before the meeting, but here we all are. We meet, of course, in an aftermath of some disappointments, some setbacks, and you will hear people, obviously with a vested interest or an ideological predisposition, who will say, well, come on now, you guys have had your chance, you've had a few tries, and you've been defeated every time. So isn't it time to pack it in? Well, those defeats, of course, oftentimes weren't really defeats. They were just reflections of how tenaciously the guardians of the status quo will defend their turf and will find any means necessary to overturn results that go against them. So most famous example, of course, being the BC referendum that passed by 58% in 2005. But the government that was elected with 43% of the vote decided that 60% was the required threshold, and it fell just short because of that. Or PEI in, I think it was 2016, where the referendum passed with 52% of the vote, but the government of the day decided that it didn't have a high enough turnout, and so that result was turned out. Or you've had elections where governments were elected on very explicit promises of electoral reform, if not proportional representation. Federally, the Trudeau government in 2015, and provincially, the CAQ government in Quebec. And then once in power, did the familiar discovery that, oh, they rather liked the system as it was, and any change was so rife with all kinds of dangers and concerns and uncertainties that we couldn't possibly actually follow through on the promises in which we were elected. So this is certainly disappointing. It is certainly a setback, but I don't think it necessarily means that there's no reason still to be working hard on this project. And, if at first you don't succeed, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly the necessity has not gone away one whit. Every election, every succeeding government seems to demonstrate in new ways, or sometimes in old ways, the problems that exist with first past the post, the manifest problems, whether it is the false majorities that governments are routinely elected with, whether it is the exaggerated weightings of some parties in some ridings versus others in defiance of the principle of one person, one vote, whether it is particularly in Canada at the federal level, the exaggerated rewards to parties that can clump their vote geographically, and therefore the incentive for divisiveness rather than taking a national vision, I think is a particularly acute problem, whether it's the incentives for strategic voting, the almost command to voters that you can't vote for the party you like, but you have to vote for a party you dislike so that you can keep a party you detest from forming a government. All of these things are in violation of basic premises that we think we live under of a democratic government, of one person, one vote, of majority rule, of that you get to choose and vote for the party of your preference. And it's only because we preserve the forms of the system we think we live in, we preserve the outward appearances rather than the actual functioning reality, that people aren't more up in arms about it. So for example, we have votes in Parliament where if anybody suggested that there should be less than that you should be able to pass laws with less than a majority of the MPs, there would be up in arms. And yet the majority of those MPs don't represent a majority of the population. There's no special significance to the people who happen to be sitting in that room that there needs to be a majority of them. The reason we insist on a majority is we have this idea that that somehow represents a majority of the public, but of course they don't. And I don't see anything terribly radical about the idea that maybe they should. So the requirements, the necessity is still there. The reasons why people have come to the conclusion, so many people, that first past the post is not a system that works in a country like Canada, in a multi-party democracy. I mean, it might work tolerably well in a two-party system with some reservations even there, but we haven't had a two-party system for more than a century in Canada. So the notion that that this is any way appropriate, I think really falls to the ground. There's still, however, and I see this every day in terms of the types of comments that people make about proportional representation or electoral reform, there still is a remarkable degree of education that has to go on. It is much better than it was. If you go back 10, 15 years, the level of discussion, even amongst people who were supposed to be knowledgeable about this, was really quite appalling. But even if it's a lot better than it was, there's still a lot of work that has to be done. I'll just emphasize a few points that I think we need to think about people who are proposing and advocating for proportional representation or electoral reform going forward need to bear in mind. I think, first of all, the biggest obstacle of any kind is the status quo, is people's numb attachment to whatever happens to be the case. In a country that is as successful as Canada, that's an understandable preference. People think, well, why rock the boat? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it requires some degree of argumentation and education to impress upon people the many ways in which it is broke, that we are successful in spite of our electoral system, not because of it. But the reason why I say the status quo is the enemy, that I think it therefore any alternative, any possibility of bringing in any alternative voting system at any level of government ought to be pursued. Because what is unique, I think it was Dave Meslin who impressed this point upon me, what is unique about Canada amongst all of the first past the post countries is that we have only first past the post at every level of government. And so people are just entirely unaware that there is any other system except one that they associate with Israel and Italy, and not all the major countries in Europe that are very well functioning and well governed places. So getting in any kind of change, I think I would recommend that people should get behind. the second thing is to say that people are not impressed by arguments about whether the number of votes a party receives corresponds with the number of seats it receives. As important as that may be to people who study it, to the average person, it sounds like statistical jiggery pokery. It sounds like you've got some sort of bee in your bonnet about exact formulas, et cetera. It doesn't resonate with them. And one of the things I try to argue is that if you really want to resonate with people, you got to build proportionality from the riding level up. What people do understand is that you don't necessarily have to have only one representative from every riding. It takes a little bit of lateral thinking to get their minds around that. But once you impress upon them, you can have riding representation. You can have a lot of the things, all the things that the good things that we'll associate with a parliamentary system, but you don't have to have one member in a riding. That fundamentally is the difference between proportional systems and first past the post. The fundamental difference is, do you have one member per riding or do you have several? And if you have several members per riding, then you don't have to give all the representation to one party's member. You can share out the representation according to, rough accordance with the share of the vote in the riding. Building proportionality in the aggregate from proportionality at the riding level is something that, in my experience, people get much more readily than going at it just from the aggregate. They can see how it's built. They can see that it's not just somebody meeting in a back room somewhere reapportioning the votes. It's a natural product of that proportionality at the riding level. So that's my second point on that. And I guess my last one is simply to say that you have to impress upon people that there is actually an alternative. Many of the arguments that I see being made, some of the most impatient, exasperated arguments, seem to proceed from the belief that there is no other system. Not just that first past the post is the best system, it's that it's the only system. And I know that sounds preposterous, but when you see them sort of sighing and rolling their eyes and saying, when you point out, for example, the anomalies in our system, and they say, well, that's how our system works. What you're describing as a feature, as a bug, is actually a feature. We don't have elections at the nationwide level. We have 338 riding level elections, and as if we didn't know that. So I think there really is an exercise you have to go through to try and open people's minds, particularly people who are most dogged on this, that the arguments they make become circular. That they proceed from the assumption that we can only ever have one member single member plurality ridings, and therefore anything that you suggest that's different from that is some kind of absurd contradiction in terms. And I'll give you an example of that. Is when people talk about this proportional representation being the system of sore losers, that you couldn't get elected under this, so you want to change the system. What they're assuming is only the winners get to go to Parliament. Only the one party's members, representatives or candidates, get to go to Parliament. So of course, if you take that as an assumption, then any other proposal must be a system of sore losers, of course. But if you can crack open that assumption and say, it doesn't have to be that isn't actually a sine qua non of a parliamentary system, that we can have, again, all the virtues we want of local representation. We just don't have to restrict it to single member plurality. Then you start to get some traction and you start to get people actually listening to what you have to say. So those are my opening remarks, and I'll be interested to hear what my colleagues have to say.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That's great. And I really like the way you talk about building proportionality from the local level up. It's a new way to look at it for us. The top down, right, is the pie charts. And we always have an abundance of pie charts, which don't connect with people as personally as how would it look different if I had an MP that represented my values, or if I had a team working for me in my riding. So I really appreciate you making that point. Okay, so our next speaker is Elizabeth May. So Elizabeth is an officer of the Order of Canada. She's an environmentalist, author, activist, lawyer. She was the leader of the Green Party of Canada from 2006 to 2019 and is the MP for Saanich Gulf Islands since 2011. Elizabeth was also executive director of the Sierra Club of Canada from 1989 to 2006. She's written 8 books, including her memoir, Who We Are, Reflections of My Life in Canada. Elizabeth has been a tireless and continuous advocate for proportional representation and a supporter of fair vote since she began her career in politics. And most recently, she pointed out the failings of our electoral system in her comments to the House of Commons about the federal 2021 budget. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth May.
Thanks, Anita. And I'll start by acknowledging the territory where you find me, which is my home. Saanich Gulf Islands is the name of my riding, and Saanich is actually a mispronunciation of the name of the Indigenous peoples on whose territory I live, which is Wasanich. And I raise my hands to you, and the language that's traditional here, Sanchothan, Haishka Siam, which is honor, respect, gratitude. And so I am grateful to live in these traditional territories. Forgive me for mentioning that I'm wearing yellow today, because today is the first anniversary of the murder of a young New Chalmers woman, Chantel Moore, who was killed by the Edmonton, New Brunswick police a year ago today. Her mom has asked people to wear yellow as a way of acknowledging how many Indigenous people are killed by police, which there is no segue. I'm going to go right into what I'm supposed to talk about, which is electoral reform. Now, of course, as Andrew mentioned, we have had proportional representation ever since Trudeau promised it. I am so grateful that 2015 was the last election under first past the post. I was, for my sins, as many of you, I'm so thrilled to see 400 participants on this call. As many of you will remember, I was on the special committee on electoral reform. We toured the country. We heard from tens of thousands of people, actually, and we met with thousands. And overwhelmingly, what we heard was that Canadians wanted to see an end to first past the post. Now, of course, we heard from the people who were committed, the people who understood the issue, and we learned a lot. The first thing we learned, by the way, was that we weren't the first committee by a long shot to study electoral reform in Canada. The first committee looked at in 1921 and concluded, again, as Andrew Coyne has already mentioned, that because we were a country that is not a two-party system, we haven't had a two-party system for more than a century, because in 1921, exactly 100 years ago, we were already a multiple party parliament. And the first parliamentary committee to ever study our voting system said it doesn't work for Canada. So I do not think this is over. I completely agree with Andrew. I think we need to make sure that we do a continual effort, which, as Anita mentioned, I do at the House whenever I see the opportunity, to point out that our political culture is toxic because our voting system punishes cooperation, rewards parties for wedge issues, which implicitly means that you don't want to find a solution. You want to be able to go into an election embracing preferably recent wounds with salt in them, because you haven't been able to cooperate to come to consensus. Consensus decision making is the enemy of the wedge issue, and a party's ability to go into riding by riding campaigns to winner take all, one seat at a time. And that creates a toxic political culture. Now, I've been a supporter of proportional representation from way before I went into politics as someone running for office. I just thought fair voting made sense. I'd seen far too many elections where we had false majority governments, as Peter Russell coined that term. Yes, I've been a supporter for proportional representation for a lot of reasons, for a long time. But living the world of politics, I have to say that my strong belief is that to have a respectful political culture where people work together and work together well, we must get rid of first past the post. When you look around the world at what countries handled COVID well, for the one notion that the thing that people noticed was it was the countries that had women leaders. It's also the countries that had some form of proportional representation in the way the leaders are elected, which also has something to do with having more women in politics as well. But I want to point to the political culture, and that's a tale of contrasts. As most of you will know, certainly on the progressive politics of this country, you get a lot of people saying, well, why don't you NDP and Greens get together? It'd be so wonderful. And of course, the reality is, or why don't you conservatives and reform people get together. You're splitting your vote, all of that kind of talk. The reality, and it's a harsh reality, is that the closer you are to another party on the political spectrum, the more they wish to see you as roadkill, as opposed to political colleagues. Now, what can change that? And this is the story of two countries, two sets of parties, quite alike in many ways, the Greens of New Zealand and the Greens of Canada, the New Democrats of Canada, and the Labour Party of New Zealand. Getting rid of first past the post is why New Zealand was able to have a Jacinda Ardern as Prime Minister in New Zealand. And I think she's probably one of the most popular prime ministers anywhere in the world. She came to power in exactly the same way that the NDP in BC came to power, with a confidence and supply agreement and support from Greens. But unlike British Columbia, where Horgan called a snap election in hopes of having all the Greens wiped out, in New Zealand, because they had adopted proportional representation in the model of mixed member proportional, MMP, back in the 90s, system of government just like ours, Commonwealth country, Westminster parliamentary democracy. But because in a number of election cycles, Labour in New Zealand had stopped treating Greens as their enemy and started realizing we could work together. They went into the 2017 election with the Greens in New Zealand and the Labour Party in New Zealand telling all their voters, don't worry, when the election is over, we're prepared to govern together. You couldn't do that under first past the post. You'd be pilloried. As a matter of fact, I was pilloried in 2008 for saying we could cooperate. So here's the thing. Our voting system punishes cooperation, promotes conflict and toxicity in how we treat each other in the political world. I think it's an extraordinary tribute to cooperation that Jacinda Ardern, having just won a majority of the seats in an MMP election in New Zealand, still put the two Green Party co-leaders into her parliament, Maori Mariam Davidson and James Shaw, Minister of Climate for New Zealand. They, even though she has no need of them to hold her government in power any longer, she needs them because she trusts them and they have good ideas, and she governs to remain collaborative. Now, this would be such a good change in Canada. We'd be able to deliver the kind of government Canadians want to see, where we sit down together and say, oh, Michael Chung and the Conservatives has a great idea there. We should pursue it. Oh, wait a minute. I really love what Jagmeet Singh just said. We should pursue it. Greens still act that way in Canada, but we don't get rewarded for it. So I would so love to point out the many, many ways that first past the post has set us back in this country, set us back on climate action, set us back on childcare, set us back on any number of issues where if we had the votes, we had the chance, we were in Parliament, we could have done it together, but it didn't suit the electoral strategy that says in a first past the post country, you treat the people closest to you on the political spectrum as your deep dyed enemies. And the enemy of your enemy is your friend. And that's how we got Stephen Harper. So that's my small rant. And I really, really do hope that we can find the way to get this issue back on the agenda. It was promised by Justin Trudeau. We should continue to demand in the next election campaign that proportional representation be a key issue. Oh, one last thing I wanted to mention to Andrew and others who are coming up. One of the things I learned on the Electoral Reform Committee, which I wanted to share, was through an Angus Reid poll. Most Canadians can't name the system of voting we use now, even on a multiple choice question of first past the post, proportional representation, ranked ballot, some other system. They don't. Only 40% of Canadians facing a multiple choice of that, assistance to them could accurately say our voting system is called first past the post. And I think one of our biggest challenges in any referendum where we are deprived of proper educational materials for at least 2 years in advance with local constituency gatherings, local town halls, whether it's a citizens jury or any other form of collaborative exercise, we need people to understand what our current voting system is now, before we can start explaining to them the multiple other forms of possibility for fair, consensus-based government. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was terrific. And I just, it was interesting that Andrew was saying that compared to 20 years ago, more people know what we're talking about when we say proportional representation. But it's still humbling to hear that only a minority of Canadians can even identify our current voting system on a list. So we have a long way to go, and that's why we're all working together to do that. I just also want to comment on the adversarial politics. As many of you who are on our mailing list know, there's a vote coming up to the Procedures and House Affairs Committee, if it ever gets there, for a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform. And it's stuck because we're in 4 months now of a filibuster, which would not be happening if we didn't have first past the post and all the wedge issues and adversarial roadblocks that it puts up. So in a way, yeah, we're stuck right now. So I'm going to introduce Judy Rebick. I'm so glad that Judy is joining us. She was one of the first sort of big names in favor of PR that I heard when I first came into Fair Vote Canada 12, 13 years ago. So Judy Rebick is a journalist, political activist, and a feminist. Judy is the former president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, former co-host of Face Off on CBC News World, and was a frequent commentator on the CBC. She is the founding publisher of Rabble.ca and author of 10,000 Roses, Occupy This, and Heroes in My Head. And I think a new book that's coming up as well. Judy co-authored one of the first op-eds in a major newspaper, the Globe and Mail, in support of proportional representation, just when Fair Vote Canada was getting started. And it was called We Vote to Scrap the System. So I'm delighted to have Judy back with us today.
Thank you very much, Anita. I'm going to talk a bit about history because, I was sort of there at the beginning of this fight. And when I first realized we needed a different system, how unfair our system was in the 1988 election. The focus of that election was free trade with the United States. And at that time, the NDP and the Liberals were opposed to the free trade agreement. Only the Conservatives supported it. And the Conservatives, and the whole election was focused on a debate on free trade. And the Conservatives voted, the Conservatives won with a minority of votes. That was Brian Mulroney, and of course brought in the free trade agreement. Now the Liberals changed their mind, and they probably would have brought in the free trade agreement anyway, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. But it's when I started to realize that our system was so undemocratic. And then, but I wasn't really active around it. But when the changes to the Constitution happened that Mulroney brought in, and the Charlottetown Accord, that was in 1992, there was a series of conferences across the country. Mulroney that point didn't have a lot of credibility on these issues. And so it was Joe Clark organized a series of what citizens conferences on the Constitution. This has really disappeared from history. I don't know why, but when the Meech Lake Accord had its 20th anniversary, there were lots of articles. But when the Charlottetown Accord, which is the only referendum in my lifetime in Canada, when the 20th anniversary of the Charlottetown Accord, there was almost no coverage at all. And that's because all the elites in the country want to forget it ever happened because they lost. But anyway, that's a different discussion. So in the Charlottetown conferences in Alberta, there was a conference on a proposal for an elected Senate. And a rather extraordinary thing happened, which is the group that was for the Triple E Senate, they called it, equal elected, and I can't remember the 30, but I'm sure somebody can.
Effective.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Equal elected effective was mainly the Reform Party. That's who the Triple E Senate people were. And NAC, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, was my group. And we made an alliance. I mean, there couldn't have been two groups further apart on almost everything. But on the elected Senate, we were going to ask for gender parity in the Senate. And they convinced us that, with the help of Doris Anderson, who is a very well-known feminist and a former president of NAC, that we should go for an election with proportional representation in the Senate. And so that was the position we argued, and we argued it from the right and from the left, and it won that conference. But sure enough, when the premiers met behind closed doors and it also won, didn't just win that conference, it also won the final conference in Vancouver. When the premiers met behind closed doors in Charlottetown, they just got rid of that notion of an elected Senate altogether. They didn't want it. A couple of the premiers said they would go for gender parity in their appointment of senators, but it didn't go much further than that. So that's when I got involved in PR, was after Charlottetown. And I guess I was a founding member of Fair Vote. If I don't remember these things very well, but anyway. And Walter Robinson is there, who was also I just see him post in the chat, who co-authored that piece with me. I think everybody was in a state of shock that we signed the same article on the Globe. In any case, and it is something about PR that you can really unite across very big political differences to support it. But I agree with Andrew that we have to keep fighting for it, but I want to talk about why I think we haven't succeeded. And I don't think it's only because the people in power don't want it. I think it's also that the people who support a different voting system tend to be a little geeky. We tend to get into like all the debates about, this system versus that system versus another system, and we get very set in our ways. I do think a mixed member proportional representation is probably the best system for Canada, but I want to work with people who are in favor of any kind of proportional system. So for example, Andrew mentioned Dave Meslin. He's been doing a spectacular job with ranked ballots. Now, it's not my favorite thing, but in London, I just want to point this out. It's a fabulous booklet that Dave just published or recently published. And he's arguing, he's a very good promoter of things. And the way he argues that ranked ballots works really well. But it's not just that. It's also in London, they used a ranked ballot system and they got an excellent result, including a Black councillor who got elected, who wouldn't have gotten, Black woman who wouldn't have got elected any other way. And I talked to talked to OBVC, which is Operation Black Vote Ontario, and they're not interested because I wanted to see if one of them wanted to come on and speak here, or at least contribute something that I could contribute. But they're not interested in PR. They don't think PR, in their assessment, helps elect a minority voter or people of color members. I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't done the work. But, a single transferable vote is another one. So I just think we have to be a little more generous with our position and be open to other ideas instead of debating it out. Let's get some electoral change. If at a municipal level, the single transfer, whatever, sorry, I've lost my thread. If at the electoral level, a different kind of proportional system works at the municipal level, let's be open to that. So that's what I think, that we need maybe a movement for electoral reform that isn't just about one system, and we can work the system out in the process. I know that's going to be like, people are going to consider that as, what's the word? Anyway, but I think we have to think about it. Not because I agree with it, I don't, but because I think we have to think about why it is we're not, even though it's great to see so many people here, that this movement isn't broader than it is. And I think maybe we need to think about really being fair vote. That is, any kind of fairer vote will support. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I really appreciate those comments. And yes, it's great to see supporters of different parties, different political orientations uniting around this issue. Not so much at the party leadership level, unfortunately, but in terms of Canadians, we've all seen those polls where, over 70% of Conservative voters would support a National Citizens Assembly on electoral reform, would support proportional representation. So, the foundation to make progress is there. I just want to address briefly one of the points that Judy made around uniting for any kind of proportional representation. And I would say in general, Fair Vote Canada is completely on board with that. We put among ourselves, I don't see a lot of squabbling anymore like there was quite a while ago. We are all happy to accept anything that's more proportional. And when the 2016 federal process came around, we put forward 3 proportional options to the Electoral Reform Committee. And some of the proposals were incremental improvements. They were included rank ballots. There was all kinds of willingness to adopt anything that's a genuinely proportional improvement. Any proportional improvement is a win for us, and we are happy to unite around that. I think in terms of our organization, the only thing we don't support is something that's a majoritarian system. And that doesn't mean that other organizations can't spring up and fight those battles if they choose. Okay, so I'm going to go on to Hugh Segal. So I'm really glad to have Hugh join us today. It's been a while, and I'm so glad to have him back. So Hugh is an officer of the Order of Canada, a former progressive conservative senator, author, and political strategist. He served as Chief of Staff to Ontario Premier Bill Davis, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and as principal of Massey College in Toronto. Hugh is a lifelong advocate for basic income, as many of you know. His most recent book is called Bootstraps Need Boots: One Tory's Lonely Fight to End Poverty in Canada. Hugh has advocated for proportional representation for decades, arguing that PR is not only fair, but it's also good for Canada's economic health. In 2018, he co-authored an op-ed for PR in the Globe and Mail with Ed Broadbent, and it was called "The Evidence is Clear, Canada Needs Electoral Reform." So I'm delighted to have Hugh Segal with us tonight. And over to you.
Thank you, Anita, and it's great to be here. I speak to you today from Canada's first capital, Kingston, Ontario, which is also on the traditional Indigenous lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat. I want to talk in my few minutes about trust and the relationship between the electoral system and trust in the government that ultimately gets chosen. You know, if you live in something other than a police state, your society operates because there is a belief in the system, there's a belief in the purposes of the system, and there's trust in the government when they make decisions which may be controversial or difficult. Voluntary compliance is what drives a society like ours, and that is actually based on trust in the system. It is fascinating to me that the political parties who often argue against proportional representation actually used ranked ballots almost consistently in their own selection of leaders, where there's several candidates on a list and you have your first and your second and your third choice. And if your first choice doesn't make it, then your other choices are allocated as you work through the ballots. So it's interesting that if they don't actually think that's worthwhile for the country as an electoral system, they do think it's the way they want to choose their own leaders. There's a little bit of hypocrisy in that process. If you look at where we are in the battle against the virus and in the pandemic, I would say 3 of the countries that have done very, very well in fighting the pandemic on their own terms, on their own turf, are New Zealand, Germany, and Taiwan, all of whom have proportional representation systems, some mixed, some more pure, but all of them work in a way where no government gets formed unless there are actually representatives of other parties in that government, representing a broader, coherent cohort of the voters, which actually builds a basis for trust, which does not exist when one party of one political affiliation forms the government all by itself and actually looks for a way to avoid cooperation with other political parties in whatever the legislature is. It's also important to think for a moment that while the first past the post gang love to attack Italy and love to attack Israel because they think the proportional representation system works really badly in those countries, it produces a measure of chaos. Well, actually, I think it's hard to find a country that has done better in the management of the pandemic and the dealing with the risk of the virus than the Israelis, despite all their other problems, and despite the pureness of their proportional representation system. And I think that says something about the measure of public compliance and belief in governments, which are making decisions not from a narrow partisan point of view, but actually from a point of view that is multi-party, reflecting a range of different views in their electorate. Pure first past the post really exists in any kind of pure sense in 3 countries now, alone in the world: the United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States. And even in the case of the United Kingdom, while that's true for the election of members of Parliament to Westminster, in Scotland and in Wales and in Northern Ireland, they actually have systems that are much more proportional. So they have actually found a better balance on that issue than we have here in Canada. I won't comment on the American system except to say that if there's ever been a definition of democratic dysfunction that is producing huge problems for Americans and huge problems for the rest of the world, that system is producing that in the United States as we speak. And I think that should be a powerful incentive for those of us who believe in proportional representation to do what Andrew suggested we do, which is keep up the fight and keep on making the case. You know, when you have an election and you have, let us say, 60 to 70% of the electorate who are eligible to vote of the population, and you only have a percentage of them who show up, and then you have a government that is formed with what might be as little as 25% of all the eligible voters who could have voted, and as we know that first past the post manufactures majorities, even though that is not what the people voted for, you can understand why governments get into difficulty when they don't really elicit the level of trust and confidence that would be the case if the party in power was a little bit more balanced and a bit more reflective of different views in the parliamentary system, such as it may be. When you have low consensus results, i.e. a vote that does not reflect the consensus, but through first past the post generates a majority, then what you have, of course, is the phenomena of all those people who voted in the first past the post system in their ridings and whose votes did not count. Because remember, in Canada today, if you take a riding in Quebec, where there may be 4 or 5 parties running, you can win the seat with 29% of the vote, 25% of the vote. That person then goes to Parliament, and that person does not really represent even a plurality of the people in his or her own constituency, let alone the voters in his region. And that is why I think first past the post has really become a burden on democracies that want to be inspired, who want to be open-minded, who want to make substantive cases based on facts and evidence and science, and need a mix of parties of different affiliations to be part of any governing coalition. I also think that the notion that in Ontario, the government has acted to remove the option for different kinds of voting in different cities and wants to do that, I think is despicable and almost criminal in terms of the damage it's doing to democracy. One of the great things about a federation is that provinces do things differently. We learn from what goes on in different provinces. Tommy Douglas did universal health insurance first in Saskatchewan, and then it spread to the rest of the country because of the work of Mr. Justice Emmett Hall, who was appointed by Mr. Diefenbaker. The report that Mr. Hall did went to Mr. Pearson because Mr. Diefenbaker lost the election of '63. And now we have a universal health insurance in Canada, which is run by the provinces. It is not perfect, but it's one of the really large consensus issues where pretty well all Canadians believe and agree that it's a good thing. It is very hard to do that now with the advent of really intense and sometimes mean-spirited social media and levels of ideological division, which are being exacerbated by folks who have an interest in doing that. Where getting a consensus electorally is really problematic. So I think that if Canada wants to step forward in a way that allows it to make substantive decisions, public policy progress on critical issues, and we still have a lot of areas in this country where the gap between what needs to happen, what is happening is very, very large. First past the post will not get us there. It is not the answer. And different measures of proportionality would, I think, make much more sense. So I think it's important that we keep up the fight, that we support each other regardless of our different political affiliations, and keep on making the case. And the way to make the case is to ask this question to our fellow citizen. Would you trust a government that is made up of only one political party, period, full stop? Or would you trust a government that had different political parties within it so that there is a bit more compromise and a little bit more cooperation when decisions were made? And I've seen those questions asked, and I've seen the results. And the vast majority of Canadians would choose the second option. So our challenge in Fair Vote Canada, so that we do not have to celebrate a 20th anniversary, but make something happen soon, is to put that question to Canadians effectively and responsibly, and to keep on doing it until we get a government that has the courage to break out of its own self-interest, i.e. they're elected through first past the post, so they'd like to keep that system in place, and have them aspire to something that's really in the public interest, which is really what proportional representation is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. And so, the way you said that, it's like you've been saying it for a long time. It's funny, once it gets internalized, what's wrong with this system, it just sort of flows off the tongue there. I really appreciate that passionate and good summary of the problems with first past the post. And I think I'm going to remember that low consensus result. So next federal election, everyone, we can note that we had a low consensus result, like when the Liberals won with 33.1% of the vote in 2019. And on election night, Justin Trudeau said he had been elected with a strong mandate. So you can sort of see the contrast between those two ideas. And we're trying to shift some mindsets to how actual consensus would be better. All right,
can I jump in hot pursuit of the point that Hugh just made?
Yeah.
Such a genius treat to be with all of you. I just want to say it again. Old friends, and my goodness, it's so lovely to be with you. I just want to say that remember that crazy postcard thing that they threw into the whole mix of the Electoral Reform Committee that came out of the blue, the Vox Populi quote that Scott Reed, a lovely Tory in the best sense of the word, called the sorting hat like Hogwarts to tell you what you were going to be. It was the strangest thing to send to Canadians because it didn't include a question, do you want to get rid of first past the post? But what it did say, Hugh, was exactly to your point. They said, would you prefer a system where you get strong decisions from a government that has all the power, or would you rather a lot of small parties? They couched it in a way that they wanted people to say, I like a strong government that makes good decisions. Or would you rather have a lot of parties have to work together all the time? And by a stunning measure, like over 80% of Canadians said, oh, I like that idea of a lot of parties having to work together to come to better decisions. And that was their own poll, and they completely ignored it. Never mind. I know I'm not supposed to do this, am I, Anita? Okay, I'm going on mute.
That's okay. I think we all remember that survey. There was more than 17 examples of even if. Would you like a more cooperative democracy, even if monkeys are jumping on your roof and, all that kind of thing? And every time they were asked, people were still saying, yes, we want it. Yes, we want it, trying to work around this mumbo jumbo in their survey. But yeah, okay. So I've got some questions that I want to get to from people who have sent them in. I've sort of condensed them, put some questions together. Of course, the main question I'm sure you all anticipate is, how do we get this? That's the first question everybody wants to know. So I'm going to focus first on the federal level and the federal parties. So this person asked, who in your opinion do you think changed the Liberal position? Justin seemed so gung-ho about it in the election run-up. And what political circumstances or conditions are needed for Justin Trudeau to acquiesce to reopening the electoral reform file, such as to a federal citizens' assembly? So, and there's similar questions along these same lines in terms of what conditions are needed, either federally or in a province, for us to be able to get traction and move forward on PR. And okay, I will I'm just going to sort of mix it up in terms of who answers first. And then after everybody's answered, if you want to comment on what each other has said, is that okay? I'll start with Judy.
Oh, I was afraid you'd do that. Well, I have to say that I think this is part of the problem. Since I stopped being involved in federal politics, which is really when I stopped working for the CBC, where Andrew and I were never on the same side. I haven't thought much about PR, and that's the truth. I'm being honest, right? Like, I was really engaged in it during Charlottetown, during the time I was president of NAC, and, you know, a certain extent when I worked on the CBC. But once I stopped, you know, it's just not the kind of issue that grabs you as an urgent issue on a day-to-day basis. If you're not involved in federal politics, sure, if you're a member of parliament, it's obvious, right? Even if you're, you know, an activist in a federal party. So I think that's part of the problem, that somehow, partly it's because of how we've discussed it. Like, I was a little mixed up before, but I remember the debate in BC, and it was like the STV people fighting the MMP people, you know, like even I didn't understand the differences after a while, you know? So there's got to be some way in which we can have a communication plan, if you want, that really means something to people. Then we have the problem with they get elected and they don't do it. So, and I, you know, I'm astonished with how much sincerity Pierre, sorry, Justin, I was just looking at Pierre Trudeau because I was looking to where measures that. Justin Trudeau can pretend to have. It just blows my mind. I just watched him speak about Indigenous issues, you know, like it blows my mind. It's like he should get the Academy Award or something. But anyway, so yeah, I don't know the answer to that, but whatever we've been doing, we have to do something different. And that's why I showed you the Dave Meslin thing, because he has, I'll just finish on this. He's got a thing about, okay, 26 people want vanilla ice cream, 20 people want chocolate ice cream, 24 people want caramel ice cream, and 30 want pickled beets. And first past the post, everybody has to eat pickled beets when there's 3 out of 4 that want ice cream. And I thought that was brilliant. Okay, like I really thought that was smart, because it show, you know, it says, oh my God, I want ice cream and I have to eat beets, you know. So I thought it was a very good way to do it. So somehow I think we have to popularize the issue more than we have and make people realize how important it is. And I think a lot of the discussion we've been having shows that, like it, you know, the first past the post reinforces all the worst behaviors in electoral politics.
Thank you, Judy. Elizabeth.
Given that our history of, and as I said, our culture and close comparisons are with New Zealand, I keep coming to that. How did New Zealand do it? They had 2 elections in a row with wrong winner results. We, you know, so as soon as if that notion of a wrong winner is kind of, it's not like the Oscars, but you know, and the winner is, but it is. We need the political scenario where the parties that traditionally balk at the idea of fair elections, because the thing about first past the post, as we all know, is that with the Conservatives, the Liberals, and even the New Democrats at different times have thought, eventually it's our turn. Certainly at the provincial level, that's why the NDP hasn't ever changed getting rid of first past the post when they had a chance. So it's, you know, eventually it's our turn. Well, if they suddenly begin to think this system is so perverse, you know, we would have gotten government if we hadn't had this system. And that's what propelled New Zealand into first launching. What they did was they had a commission of inquiry and a well-known jurist who held hearings all over. And then they did, as we all know, I think we all know, this group is very well informed, 2 different referenda to get to where they ended up. That's the key thing. The other thing, of course, is reminding people every chance you get, well, you see this result that you just don't like, that wouldn't have happened if we hadn't had first past the post. Another argument for Canadians that I don't think we've used enough, which again is, we are a country that suffers, I think, from regionalism. Whenever you get to a point where you think, how can it be that we can't put together, like the current prime minister can't put together a cabinet that includes people from Alberta because they don't have any elected Liberals in Alberta. Do they not have any people who voted Liberal in Alberta? Of course they do. They have people who voted Liberal. So again, we would do much better to keep the Federation together if we were able to have people from all parties elected to every parliament.
And Hugh.
I actually think that those of us who believe in moving towards proportional representation, and those parliamentarians in the Green Party and New Democratic Party, I think they have to begin to think about framing their questions on matters of substance in the House of Commons, not on the actual matter of substance itself, although that should be part of it, of course, but who is the government to be making this decision? By what authority do you, with 38% or 33% of the vote, have the right to make this decision without some broad consultation beyond your own narrow little party? If you don't make that part of the political rhetoric, if you don't question the legitimacy of parties with 34% of the vote, and that's 34% of the 60% who showed up to vote, so that's a very small percentage of the population. If you don't question their ability to make difficult decisions as part of the political back and forth, you're not going to build any public anxiety about the system itself. And if you do want to move to a new system, a better system, a more democratic system, a more inclusive system, you do have to sow some doubt about the present system and its legitimacy and its capacity to reflect Canadians. I don't think our opposition politicians do that. They may have decided perhaps that there's no media coverage in that, or that's too obscure a point, but it wouldn't be if there were opposition days focused on just that issue. And then you'd begin to see the media say, well, wait a minute, there's something going on here. We have some pretty tough things to decide, whether it's about the pandemic or whether it's about military procurement or whatever the issue is. And who are these guys to be doing it on their own simply because they got 33% of the vote? So I think we have to ramp that up a bit if we're going to get a public that then puts pressure through the polling system on governments to begin the kind of process of reform that several of our colleagues made reference to this evening.
I think that's a great idea, Hugh. And it gives us something to go when we go to lobby our MPs, even the ones that are supportive. It gives us something concrete to ask them in terms of helping them to frame this issue in a way that's helpful for advancing discussion of proportional representation outside of this bubble. Okay, does anybody else have a comment before I go on to the next question? Yeah, Andrew.
So first of all, I guess I think we've learned that what Justin Trudeau says and what he believes are often two very different things. So I don't think anybody should be counting on him to be initiating anything in this regard, and he wouldn't have any credibility if he did. People would just say, look, you know, you said you were going to do this last time. Why would we believe you this time? Frankly, I'm a little skeptical that anything is really going to happen at the federal level anytime soon. I hope to be proven wrong on that. I think the greater opportunities are not even at the provincial level, but at the municipal level, at least for getting the ball rolling. Now, as I say, typically municipal politics don't even have parties, so it's hard to hang on one second. Just have to plug in my power here. It's hard to imagine, you know, full-blown PR at the municipal level, but you can get, at least as we've seen in Ontario, and if we can crack open the vice that Premier Ford has put on the process, you can at least experiment with different types of voting that can at least, as I say, crack open this idea that there's only one system, there's only ever been one system, you can't possibly even imagine another system. Once we have living, breathing examples of other voting systems on the ground in Canada, then you can no longer dismiss it as some weird wacko thing that they do in far off countries where they're, you know, they speak strange languages and you know, they're hotbeds of instability and all the nonsense that gets folded out. What tends to happen in any of these debates, whenever the referendums come around, is they become referendums on, do you want to live in Canada? And so you really have to kind of, we have to do some spade work to prevent that. in terms of opening up to people's ideas that it's possible to have different types of voting systems and different types of electoral systems in Canada. And the cities may be the place that have the best chance of actually starting that ball rolling. I think in terms of approaches to it, and there's been some very good things said previously on this round of questions, but let me just add a couple of thoughts. One is that I think there's still a lot of work to do in and Hugh was sort of getting at this, of denormalizing the status quo. What do I mean by that? Even those of us who are immersed in proportional representation and are fully aware of the manifest defects of first past the post, once the bell rings and once there's an election on or whatever, we all fall into the same habits of mind. It's very seductive. It's very hard to break out of. So for example, the minute an election is called, or even in the offing, we in the media will do a thing on the battleground ridings, the ridings to watch. We can't help ourselves, right? Because it shows how in the know you are, that you can identify which of the ridings are. And no one ever stops to go, wait a minute, isn't every riding supposed to be a battleground riding? You know, with this business that this election will be decided in these 14 ridings, it's insane. The election is supposed to be decided in 338 ridings, but it's very easy to fall into that. Or the siren call of strategic voting. It's very hard. You have to really stop yourself and say, wait a minute, why is this the message that the Liberals are putting out election after election, that you can't possibly vote for the NDP because you'll just let the Tories in? Why do we let them get away with that? Why do we let them, the assumption be normalized that of course you can't think of voting for the party you'd prefer to vote for, you have to vote strategically. We need to really call that out every time we see it. But beyond that, I think it's also very important to understand, a pollster, I can't remember who it was, said this to me at once, and it stuck with me. He said, people don't really care what happens on election day. What matters to them is what happens every day in between. And I think that's an important point to make as well, is the follies and defects of first past the post are not by any means limited to what happens on election day. But what happens on election day colors and shapes what happens every day in between, because the voting system is how we keep score. It's the system of rewards and penalties, and therefore it's the thing that affects behavior in the every day in between the election. What accounts for how the parties and the politicians behave, because they're responding to this incentive system. And when you have this massively leveraged system where a 2% swing in the popular vote leads to this extraordinary swing in the number of seats. Well, any of us, if the job we were in, we were on that kind of knife edge, we'd behave in very strange ways. So I think identifying the ways in which it affects political behavior every day in between, the massive policy lurches you see on the basis of very little change in the popular vote, but we get completely different policies from one election to another, that just is massively destabilizing, et cetera. I think that's something to focus on. And I'll just close off there. I think I think the chances of electoral reform happening at the federal level in the next little while are remote. But I think if you can build it up from the municipal and the provincial level, then you can start getting credible examples of how it can actually work in Canada. And that way you beat the scare stories and you beat the attachment to the status quo.
Can I jump on a rapid response on what Andrew just said? Because it was just so resonant for me. I mean, when I was elected, which is, I can't believe it, 10 years ago, I've been, when I talk to kids in the riding, I've been their MP for so long, they never know that this was a famously safe Conservative seat and no one could ever win here except the member of the Conservative cabinet at the time. And what I heard from people was, you don't run here. This is a terrible thing. What you're doing here, we're going to split the vote. You're going to guarantee he's going to get in again. It's a terrible thing what you're doing. And the secret of winning the election against a sitting member of Stephen Harper's cabinet as the only Green was that people got excited about the power of their vote, and people who'd given up turned out to vote. So we had the highest voter turnout in the country in Saanich Gulf Islands the year I won, except for one of the PEI ridings, but you know how they are. So it was amazing to have 75% voter turnout in Saanich Gulf Islands when the average turnout in that election in 2011 was, I think, 60-some%. And so that's one of the things that I'd also like to think that we throw into the dialogue and the discourse of, why does it matter to get rid of first past the post? Well, if you are an NDP voter in Alberta, you just get so discouraged, you don't bother to turn out. And what we do when we say to people, stop thinking about strategic voting, think about getting somebody elected because you vote for what you want. And that empowers and inspires in a democracy. And I think we have to say to people, getting voter turnout up will happen when we get rid of a system that not just depresses the numbers, but really depresses the voter, so that you just think, I'm staying home. I'm the stay-at-home party because this is just too much of a rigged game. I know my vote won't matter, so I'm not even going to bother.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just wanted to add a couple of small points. So a few people have brought up municipal PR and municipal electoral reform in general. So I just want to point out to people who are in Ontario, where Doug Ford has revoked local choice for cities, that about 62% of municipalities in Ontario elect members at large. What that means is that they already elect more than one winner per ward. And so when that local choice comes back, if any of those cities adopt a ranked ballot, they will have proportional representation in their city. And it would be the first time we've had proportional representation municipally since I think, Winnipeg in the 1950s. So that would be a huge breakthrough, and Fair Vote spent quite a lot of time working in Guelph in the last year towards that end, because they have 2-member wards. So just to let you guys, we're there. We're completely supportive of local proportional representation.
This is a
yeah.
very good point, is if you get either multi-member ridings or ranked ballots, you're halfway there.
Yeah, I agree with you, Andrew.
And sometimes things have to be done, you can't do it in one leap. Fine. I know there was a big debate at one time in Fair Vote, and people said, oh, we can't have ranked ballots because we only get one shot at this. I don't believe that. I think that if you can crack open the status quo, then all things become possible, because then you can actually have a debate on the merits of things rather than just, do you want to live in Canada?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I think that any kind of proportional system is better than what we have. And if we can get the ranked ballots at the municipal level, then we can point to that the governments are more stable, they're more representative, all of those things. Because the debate has always been, well, look at Israel. Well, they don't say it anymore, but look at Israel and Italy, right? And it's an unstable, and we have a stable government, and all those kind of stupid arguments. And I didn't realize they're still making those arguments. But anyway, yeah, I think we have to. I think that's important. You said you're already doing that, Anita, but I noticed in the chat people are already debating. Somebody says, "Oh, ranked isn't really proportional," and blah, blah, blah. Like, if we keep doing that, we're just going to keep losing. We've got to get people excited about it, which means it's got to happen. I agree.
Yeah.
Like, it happened in London and people are excited about that. And now for example, OBVC supports a ranked ballot because it did get a Black woman elected who wouldn't got elected in either, and in another system, right? In a first past the post system. So yeah.
It's just a fun little tale out of school from the Electoral Reform Committee, because we often, those of us who've been pushing for proportional voting, were blamed by someone. Said, well, if you hadn't rejected ranked ballots, we could have made some progress just for fun. Turns out, I can share, none of the members of the committee from any party ever put ranked ballots forward as something we could vote on as a committee as a proposal. So we didn't reject it. Nobody proposed it. And that was I have to say that when we talk about Justin Trudeau and how sincere he seemed about getting rid of first past the post in the 2015 campaign, I was probably the most shocked person on the face of the planet when I ran into a reporter leaving Center Block who was saying, oh yeah, Karina Gould's just about to do a press conference to say they're not going to do it anymore. And I thought, that can't be true. I was so sure we were doing it. Never mind. But I don't give up on getting it federally either, Andrew. I agree with you. It's less likely, but as soon as any one jurisdiction moves, I think we'll all move. But it just depends on the political climate, and if the Liberals or the Conservatives realize, or preferably both, that somehow or other this has not benefited them in a key way a couple of times, we can still get it federally.
Okay, so I wanted to move on to, probably we'll just have time for one more question. So someone's written in, and this is another theme that we hear quite a lot. Do politicians represent the people who elected them, or are there people, are they just there to vote for a particular party? And so I'd sort of like to add a little bit to that, because in meeting with MPs, believe it or not, there are liberal MPs who support proportional representation. And some of the themes that we tend to hear is when MPs have more independence to be able to speak their minds without the degree of party discipline, then we might start seeing a little bit more progress on some of these issues. And I don't know if that's the case or that's not the case, but I would love to hear your opinions on how these two issues relate, if they do. Oh, who should I ask first? I'll ask Hugh.
Well, look, to be fair to the present government, there's been a process where the Senate, as it's now constituted, which is not quite the harsh partisan body it used to be because of the way in which they now go about approving appointments before the nominees are given to the Prime Minister for his recommendation to the Governor General. They have made a very substantial amount of amendments to bills, which the government, to its credit, have largely accepted. So that indicates that when you decide that the matters of confidence are precise, the budget, the throne speech, perhaps the odd matter of national security, there's a wide range of other areas where independent members of parliament within existing political parties can actually make amendments and changes, which then the government will look at on its merits. And I would make the case that the more of that happens, and the more of that happens around the issue of the government of the day doesn't really have the electoral authority to be doing this. Therefore, input from other parties should be part of the amending process. And the government's legitimacy is tied to its ability to be fair-minded about those amendments. Then you begin to get a process in which, when a government chooses arrogance over cooperation, you can do the who do you think you are with 33% of the vote kind of question. So in a way, it's a setup so that if they play ball responsibly with other views, they don't have to face that pressure. But when they take the narrow partisan, my party uber alles approach, they will face some difficulty, and that will be constructive for the population to say, we've got to find a way to do this better.
Andrew?
I'm not as optimistic as Hugh on that front. I'll leave aside my difficulties with the Senate, but I think the biggest obstacles to MPs' independence is MPs. They themselves have grown up in the system, have been schooled in the system in which they have inculcated in themselves the idea that they are supposed to be obedient foot servants to the party leadership. They're selected, first of all, on that basis, or they self-select. You're unlikely to be nominated or chosen if you're not seen as a team player. And even if they were inclined to be more independent-minded once they get in there, it's beaten out of them. And it's beaten out of them because it's a team sport, they'll be told. You and your precious conscience don't wreck this for everybody. If you do this, you're going to let the other guys get in, and they're so horrible that that's not even contemplatable. So therefore, you have to stick with the team. And this is drummed into them every single day, and very, very, very few of them emerge from it with their sense of self intact. And it just becomes this vicious circle where they just become more and more subservient and more habituated to the idea that that's their role in the parliamentary system, is just to stand up and sit down when they're told. It really is quite demoralizing when you read some of the interviews, for example, the exit interviews from MPs that Samara Institute has been carrying out, when you realize just how completely confused they are about their own role. They themselves can't identify what the role of a member of parliament is supposed to be, other than simply to vote as the whips tell them. So I don't think that's going to change in it.
Andrew just froze.
We lost Andrew.
Lost Andrew. I guess the plug in didn't work.
He may be back. Do you want to comment, Judy?
Yeah, sure. So first I want to correct something. I made a mistake. Rick says Ariel got elected in London with ranked ballot, not because of the vote counting, but because she ran knowing she stood a better chance of winning. she would have won under first past the post too. So he's corrected that. That's not what I was told. So thank you. Okay, so I agree with Andrew 100%. Like our political system right now is, I think it's catastrophic, and it's worse than it used to be. You know, first of all, we had the, you know, we don't have to be partisan about this. I mean, we have the Reform Party and the Conservatives, and I mean the Conservative Party that he was part of, it just doesn't exist anymore. The Liberal Party is just full of shit constantly. Sorry, but you know, they constantly say things they don't mean. Like, it's horrible. I can't believe one thing that Trudeau says, nothing. And it's a horrible feeling. I mean, I don't like Brian Mulroney, but I usually believed half of what he said. You know, I can't believe anything Trudeau says. And, you know, in the NDP, I'm not sure what's happening with the NDP. It's mixed. So, and I agree that members of parliament think they can't speak. It's worse at the federal level, at the provincial level, but they think they can't speak out because they'll get, you know, it's a lack of courage, I agree, but it's also because the discipline. I mean, the kind of stuff when they vet candidates now, it's ridiculous. If you have like one tweet that they don't like, they make you take it down. It's just an absurd system. It's not a democratic system anymore. You know, I'm getting to the point where I might become an anarchist in my old age, because like, I can't see a way for this, the way this system works is deteriorated. It was bad to start with and it's deteriorated. And I agree 100% with what Andrew said. And, you know, I think we've got to, which I can't believe I even said that. But anyway, I really think we have a terrible system, and first past the post is only part of that. And we have to deal with all of it. Reform of all, political reform is critical, or we're not going to be able to make much progress.
And Hugh had made a good point, you know, tying electoral reform into issues that people actually care about, and why are we so many years behind on so many issues? And a lot of it is related to these interconnected things, you know, the adversarial politics, the false majorities, the policy lurch, all the things we're so familiar with, and MPs not being able to speak up.
Yeah.
When those things happen. Go ahead.
Oh, I know Andrew's back and he hadn't finished his point, but I'd love to jump in on this. But which way should we go? And need to
How
go
about
back?
you go ahead, Elizabeth, and then Andrew will finish. Okay?
Just checking, because look, I'm reflecting on my years, and I cannot believe, again, it hit me like it's sort of surprising, because I feel like I'm still new and young. I'm so delusional. I'm 67, about to get a knee replacement, and I've been in Parliament for 10 years. So anyway, I love Parliament. I love being a parliamentarian, but I hate being described as a politician. And I think the difference is, I look at what's wrong with Parliament, and I disagree with you, Andrew. I can't blame the individual MPs. I look at it, and it was really Peter Russell in his wonderful little volume, 2 Cheers for Minority Government, where he talked about what's eating away at our democracy is the power of well-organized, well-funded political parties. So obviously the Greens are not well-organized or well-funded, and it's fantastic because we have as a matter of our rules of conduct that we have no whipped votes. And when I see the MPs who are elected, and I've seen now a few years worth of new people arriving, they are wonderful human beings. Regardless of party, they come to Ottawa because it's like Mr. Smith goes to Washington. They run for office because they want to be doing public service. And then they're told, well, you don't need to know the rules. We'll tell you what happens next. This is how you're going to vote. This is what you're going to do. They are funneled, and I've seen this happen a lot, that the critic positions are given to the people who show up in Ottawa caring about issue X. They're never going to be the critic for issue X. They know too much about it. They're going to give the back room guys headaches. So what we need to do is reduce the role that backroom political party strategists and political operatives have in controlling the House of Commons agenda. Individual members of Parliament need to have the right to speak up, do the thing they need to do for their constituents, their conscience. They need to have the power of free speech and the power to vote, except on matters of confidence. I can see that for sure. But on every single issue, they are all, in all the other parties, instructed how to vote every time. And believe me, the system of punishments is significant and severe. Losing being a chair of a parliamentary committee, losing an opportunity to ask a question anytime. My friend Bruce Heyer, who joined me and sat as a Green, that was after more than a year and a half of not being allowed to ask a question because he hadn't gone along with, I won't go deeply into the issue of party policy. There are a lot of ways to punish MPs, and you don't want to be punished. We have to take the punishments away and encourage people to be the wonderful, public spirited Canadians who chose to run for office in the first place.
All right, Andrew.
Oh, just to finish up before my computer ran out of power. I was going to say, I'll say to Elizabeth again, I agree with everything you say, except the people who have the power to change it are the people who don't want to change it. It's all very well to say we need to give MPs more power, but the people who are in charge have no interest in doing that. And as I say, I don't think the MPs themselves have internalized the idea that they want that. And the clearest example of that was Michael Chong's Reform Act. If ever there was a moment at which, I mean, the problem, of course, is to each of the, even if you did have a lot of MPs who wanted to change things, even if you did have that, none of them wants to stick his neck out and be the first to do it. So there's the problem of trying to get everybody to move at the same time. The Reform Act was that opportunity, that everybody could kind of move at the same time. All the parties could move at the same time, so nobody would be taking an undue risk. And even then, they didn't do it. They did this cynical game of passing it and then basically neutering it. And MPs in their party meetings, when they had the opportunity to, as the bill provided, to vote to give themselves the power, didn't do so because they'd been told by the party leaders not to do so.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
they had a revolution set on a plate for them. All they had to do was just tuck into it, and they all pulled away from the table and said, I don't think I can do this. So what I was going to finish off by saying is, I think you're more likely to get MPs independence as a result of proportional representation than the other way around. That if by some miracle the planets can align, that you can actually get a changed electoral system, and particularly, as I say, the ones where you have multiple MPs from each riding, with ranked ballots in the mix, then MPs can only get elected in that system when they've got cross-party appeal, and that cross-party appeal can give that MP a measure of independence from the party apparatus because he doesn't have to necessarily depend on them. He doesn't have to answer to them on everything. He's got an independent power base in his riding. And that, I think, is ultimately what's going to give whatever glimmer of hope there is for more independence of MPs is when you change the electoral system.
Also, Andrew, there's one of your previous columns from, I don't know how long ago it was, pointing out that when you want to see MPs standing up and representing constituents, one of the ways in which they're punished is by the media writing, oh, look, there's dissension in the ranks and that party doesn't have good party discipline. And that's elevated as though that shows you've got good governance if you make sure that all of your MPs check their brains at the door and do what they're told.
No, that's absolutely right.
Yes, because you said it. That's why I mentored it.
And I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah.
So we have only about 3 minutes left. Does anyone want to add anything to what's been recently said or have any closing thoughts tonight?
If I haven't spoken too much already, I did want to get one thing on the agenda because I think it needs saying, which is I think there tends to be too much preaching to the converted. Obviously, we're at a meeting of Fair Vote. We're obviously going to be preaching to the converted, but as a broader statement. And there's two groups in particular that I think maybe reformers tend to write off, but I think can be, if approached correctly, approached. And that is conservatives and Westerners, which in many cases is an overlap. Conservatives tend certainly to cling to the status quo and to say, if we had proportional representation, we'd get wiped out because there's just one party of us and the other parties are all against us. And we can only ever win power by winning a majority if we somehow squeeze through by getting a fluke of 40% of the vote. It's an odd stance for them to be taking because the first past votes has not really worked very well for conservatives. they're famously losers at particularly at the federal level, where the Liberals have won, what is it, 3 out of every 4 elections in the last 100 years. And what's striking about that is that the rise of liberal hegemony absolutely coincided with the quote unquote splitting of the vote on the left of center. So Liberals and NDP and now Greens have been splitting the vote for decades, and yet somehow are able to form governments. And I think the lesson in that is when you have more than one party within a particular broad political grouping, it doesn't just split the available pool of voters, it expands it. In any given discussion, policy discussion, when you've got a Liberal, an NDP, and a Conservative, sorry, we'll leave the Greens out for this one example, the Tories are always the odd man out. It's always basically the Liberals and the NDP saying, we basically agree with each other, and the Tories are just these horrible people who don't get it. If there was 2 conservative parties, as there are 2 right of center parties, as there are 2 or 3 or 4 left of center parties, they'd have a chance to say, oh, actually, we're not just the weirdos here. There's actually several number of people who think along these lines. And what I think the example of that was when you looked at the so-called vote splitting between the Reform Party and the old Progressive Conservatives, they got between them a larger share of the vote on average than the United Conservative Party ever has. So I think conservatives need to be approached from a self-interest standpoint of saying, this can actually be a system that can work for you, that can give you a fighting chance of moving the center of ground of Canadian politics towards you, rather than, as they imagine it, consigning them to permanent opposition status. I know we shouldn't be necessarily approaching people on the basis of self-interest, but self-interest work. And the final point I'll just make is in terms of Westerners and Albertans in particular. Why did the Liberal Party, why do they not need to pay any attention whatsoever to Alberta opinion on energy issues or environment or what have you? Why can they just completely ignore it? It isn't just because Liberals are never going to win many seats in Alberta because of first past the post. It's also because they can basically lock up most of the majority by winning pluralities of the vote in Ontario and Quebec. So even before the election ever gets to the West, it's basically decided, because as it happens historically, the Liberals are able to clump their vote geographically in the areas of the country that have the most votes. So there's something in it for Westerners and Albertans in breaking up that system, that if every party had to search for votes and seats in every part of the country, then we wouldn't see this kind of regional polarization that has so often been to the disfavor of the West. I mean, it's amazing that Albertans keep continuing to turn out to vote because, the West has been voting conservative since 1953. And most of the time they're in opposition. But imagine if, as I say, if every party had to chase votes and chase seats in every part of the country, we'd have a much more balanced and nuanced approach to some of these issues that wouldn't produce these terrible us or them regional politics around these issues.
So I want to do this panel again, over and over again. And the next one is on climate, and I'll dispute that Alberta doesn't have anything to do with Canadian energy policy, but I'm not going to dispute it right now, but park it for later. By the way, I would love to do this with you guys every day of the week. What a treat. And we still have about 400 people watching. Is amazing. So congratulations to Fair Vote. I've just had so much fun.
This has been a great panel. So many terrific themes coming up. And yeah, I mean, Judy had mentioned, accidentally said Pierre Trudeau instead of Justin Trudeau. And it's worth reminding everybody that Pierre Trudeau was advocating for proportional representation in the media in 1979 because of the same issues that we're having, which is, complete sweeps of the Western provinces, no liberal representation, and the divisiveness that caused 40 years ago, and it still causes today. So just as true now as before. So I want to thank everybody for taking an hour and a half to join us. I'm glad to hear that you're all still so convinced, passionate. We've got some good takeaways from this panel, some things that we'll continue to work on. Your support has been greatly appreciated. And everyone who spent the last hour and a half with us, I really appreciate it. And so when you log off, I'm going to remind everybody that we do have a donation page. If you enjoyed this, we can do more of them. You can become a monthly donor and help us keep up this work to reach people. Also encouraging you to register for tomorrow. We have Mumalak Kakak, who is the NDP.
Oh, I love her. I love her.
Nunavut, and yeah, I thought she'd be really interesting.
And
Someone-
she's not running again. It's such a shame.
She's not running again, and the reason why I thought, oh, I'll ask her to come talk, it's nothing to do with her being NDP. It's just the idea of 25 when she got elected, I think, from Nunavut, passionate advocate, coming to Parliament with those ideals that we all just talked about, and having that perspective on how our system is working or not working would be really useful, something for us to learn about. So I encourage everybody to check out our sessions tomorrow. And thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.